There's not quite anything in Clash Royale's entire history that says pure chaos like the Halloween 2019 season does. A small mistake from Supercell set off a deadly chain reaction that would lead to a pay-to-win mess, a brain-dead meta, chaos, confusion, and anguish from Clash Royale players. This is the horrifying story of the Halloween 2019 season in Clash Royale. A large factor that contributed to how chaotic the Halloween 2019 season was would be the balance changes that were designed for that month, but also how the previous month's balance changes influenced the upcoming meta. Let me explain. Starting with the September 2019 balance changes, the Executioner would receive some of the strangest reworks a card in the game's entire history has ever received. I did make a mention of this in a previous video, but essentially, following the first rework, the Executioner had become a ranged mini-P.E.K.K.A that could do area damage, but the issue was that it was so slow that the rework didn't really do anything. So then, Supercell would make a more balanced rework by slightly reducing his damage but increasing his range to compensate, and this version of the Executioner was very strong. In fact, it was probably the strongest version of the Executioner in Clash Royale history. He was extremely versatile and very strong, not just in damage but also being able to attack both air and ground. This version of the Executioner would prevail for the entirety of October of 2019. But if this broken version of the Executioner wasn't already unhealthy for the game, then the balance changes of the October 2019 season would prove to be so much worse. There's a lot to unpack for the October 2019 balance changes. Starting with the Night Witch, Clash Royale would increase her death bats from 2 to 4. While this seems like a very basic change, the impact that this change would have on how strong the Night Witch was would be monumental. The death bats of the Night Witch is what makes her a legendary card. While it is controversial on whether or not the Night Witch deserves to be legendary, her death bats is what made her absolutely broken. The issue with having 4 death bats at death was that she could counter so many cards without even being alive, and bats were arguably a better support card to the Night Witch than the skeletons were to the Witch, since the bats could attack both air and ground, while skeletons could only attack ground. Every time the Night Witch has had 4 death bats, she has been absolutely game breaking. With speculation on how strong the Night Witch would be leading up to the new season, Clash Royale would continue with the controversial balance changes, and the Halloween 2019 Witch rework would be the strangest rework in the game's entire history. In fact, it was my choice for the worst balance change in the game's entire history. The Witch would receive 7 major changes to her stats. Keep in mind, the Witch only really has a total of 10 stat points, so only 3 of her stat points were left untouched after this change. The most notable change during this balance change was that her damage was increased by a whopping 220%, and her damage per second was increased by 127%. This would make the Witch one of the best cards in the game's entire history, since she now filled the role of so many different cards and was extremely strong. With there now being 2 extremely strong cards that had similar roles at the playbase's disposal, players would begin to prepare for a miserable Night Witch and Witch meta, but what really happened would turn out to be much worse. At the beginning of the October 2019 season, Clash Royale would announce the release of a brand new card called the Elixir Golem. Players would first be able to use it in the Elixir Golem challenge, which was set up to be a draft style challenge, meaning one player would get to draft the Elixir Golem while the other player would have to play against it. This made the challenge quite unfair, since the player who got the Elixir Golem would be at an advantage, and since draft picks were already quite bad, the existence of the Elixir Golem just made the whole challenge even worse. And once the challenge began, players began to truly realize how broken the Elixir Golem was. When we compare the Elixir Golem stats to what it is today, the Golem itself had 8% more health, and the Golemites and Elixir Blobs had around 12% more health. However, it does have the same damage as it did at release. But what made the Elixir Golem truly overpowered wasn't just its health, it was its elixir distribution. The current day Elixir Golem gives 1 elixir when the Golem itself is destroyed, then 0.5 elixir per Golemite, and 0.5 elixir per Elixir Blob, for a total of 4 elixir. The day 1 Elixir Golem did give the same amount of elixir at death, but it only gave all 4 elixir after the 4 Golemites were destroyed. This was the main reason the Elixir Golem was broken. When defending the current day Elixir Golem, you at least regain some elixir while killing the Elixir Golem, which can be used to defend it even more. But the issue with the day 1 Elixir Golem was that you would only be granted 4 elixir basically once the Elixir Golem had been defeated completely, and if your opponent placed an Elixir Golem, you would either have to wait until your tower could kill each stage of the Elixir Golem until the final stage, or wait wait for your elixir to regenerate. It was just painful to have to wait till the very end to regain elixir, and at that point, there probably wouldn't have even been a point in having the elixir advantage, because the Elixir Golem was intended to be played when the opponent had low elixir, and when the user had a means to defend. Since it had so much health, it would take an extremely long time to kill, and by the time you started to gain elixir back from the Elixir Golem, your opponent could not only generate more elixir to either defend or attack, but you would have also taken significant damage on your tower. It was just a lose-lose situation for the defender. Overall, its cheap cost and unfair elixir distribution is what made the Elixir Golem a nightmare for players, but the situation gets worse. The format of the challenge was made in such a way that if a player had got to 8 wins, they could get early access to the Elixir Golem. Now, this was normal for challenges at the time, but what made this challenge in specific annoying was that players that had access to the Clash Royale could comfortably lose as many times as they wanted, since they could have free re-entries into the challenge, and these players would mostly need it, since draft in itself was already such an unbalanced game mode. So not only did pay-to-win players directly benefit with this privilege, the fact that it was a draft challenge meant that free-to-play players would be at a greater disadvantage, and it doesn't help that the Elixir Golem in itself was not only an extremely annoying card since it had so much health and it was so hard to kill, but it was also a lower rarity card, meaning it was easier to level up. Another thing that made this challenge quite different from the other pre-release card challenges was the gap between early access and official release of the Elixir Golem. There was a 1-month gap between the time the Elixir Golem challenge had started and the official release of the Elixir Golem, which means players that played the challenge at the very start would have special access to the Elixir Golem for an entire month before everyone else had access to it. This was the nail in the coffin. There are so many issues with the idea that only a specific group of players could have access to an absolutely broken card. Firstly, it gives casual and free-to-play players a good reason to buy the Clash Royale, which directly promotes pay-to-win. Additionally, it kind of creates a separation in ladder, especially since only the most skillful or pay-to-win players could have access to the card. And finally, it kind of gave the Elixir Golem immunity from being nerfed. This is because the card had not even been released during the October 2019 season, so if Clash Royale did decide to nerf the card while it hadn't even been released, it would have caused players to turn away from the card when it would officially be released, which in turn would lead to lower interest and therefore less hype around the release, which is something Clash Royale would never want. Additionally, so much of Clash Royale's attention would be occupied by the execution due to the controversial balance changes of the September 2019 season that the Elixir Golem slipped under the radar. Combining this with the extremely long period of time where the Elixir Golem was unusable to most players would make the Halloween 2019 season an absolute mess. Given how strong the Elixir Golem was at release, and how strong both the Night Witch and the Witch were made to be in the October 2019 season, there's only really one word that could describe the meta that would follow: horrifying. Being a tank, the Elixir Golem would synergize extremely well with the Night Witch, since the Night Witch had already synergized well with large tanks, so this was a pairing that was unmissable in top ladder. Then, the Witch could also be used alongside this pairing, simply because the Witch was just overpowered. There really wasn't a disadvantage to use the Witch with a pairing like this. These three cards would go on to ruin the meta. A very popular deck that included the Elixir Golem was this one. This deck was unbeatable. Playing against Elixir Golem, drop a Night Witch and a baby dragon. Playing against Double Witch, drop a Mega Knight to counter both. Don't have Mega Knight or don't have enough elixir, use poison to kill both Night Witch and Witch. There were very few matchups that countered this deck, some of them being P.E.K.K.A Bridge Spam and P.E.K.K.A Executioner, but since the P.E.K.K.A had received a nerf in the October 2019 balance changes, usage rates of P.E.K.K.A was already low. Even cards like the Fisherman encountered the Elixir Golem, since he could have hooked it away from the tower or hooked away a Witch or Night Witch, but again, Fisherman had also received a nerf during the October 2019 balance changes. Despite not even being released, the Elixir Golem had a whopping 13.1% usage rate above 7,000 trophies, and of this 13% usage rate, 10% was with both the Night Witch and the Witch. So basically, every time you verse the Elixir Golem, it would be guaranteed that you were versing both Witches. The surge in Witch and Night Witch usage rate even caused the Mega Knight usage rate in the top ladder to climb from 5% to 15%. The issue with a card like the Elixir Golem being so meta changing is that, in simple words, it was a complete no-skill card. The strategy was simple. Play either Night Witch or Witch in the back to bait spells or force elixir out of the opponent. Wait until your opponent either has no elixir or you've had the chance to build up a Night Witch or Witch and play Elixir Golem in front. Cards like the Night Witch and Witch in the October 2019 state was so strong that the opponent would often need to commit more than their respective elixir cost to counter both, unless of course the opponent was carrying a lightning or rocket. If the opponent was able to defend your push, then they would have had a lot of elixir and a big counter push, meaning they would probably clump their cards together. This means you could also play a Mega Knight and Baby Dragon to defend the entire push. With the Mega Knight already being a controversial card, its surge in popularity in top ladder was infuriating for some players, and the fact that a support card like the Witch had almost a 40% usage rate was concerning. This was the same reason Sparky was seen in some of these decks. The Sparky could defend an incoming push that had been formed as a result of losing an Elixir Golem pretty well due to its high damage output. The Elixir Golem double Witch combination had become so bad that the most popular deck during the month was a direct counter to both the Witch and the Night Witch. P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam had finally been dethroned as being one of the most versatile archetypes in the history of Clash Royale, but the new archetype at the top was arguably worse. It's hard to understand truly how boring the game had become at this point. Even Miner paired with Elixir Golem would turn out to be a deadly combination. As I mentioned before, since the Elixir Golem would only give Elixir away at the final stage, if you could defend it so it never reached this final stage, then you would basically automatically win the game, all while causing your opponent to be extremely frustrated. The Miner filled this role. If you played the Miner in such a way as to tank for the Elixir Golem as soon as the big Golem was killed, then the Golemites would wreck the tower. And it's not just Elixir Golem that both Witches thrived with. Giant Double Witch would appear 6% of the time in top ladder, and Golem Double Witch would appear 4% of the time. Beatdown was dominating the meta. Elixir Golem, Night Witch, and Witch single-handedly killed Bait and P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam, and many bad cards would shoot up in popularity such as the Bomb Tower, since it could counter the Elixir Golem Double Witch combination. It was truly a miserable time to be playing the game. Almost every second or third match would include a beatdown deck with either the Night Witch or the Witch, or both, all with the same brain dead strategy, and Clash Royale wouldn't even issue a nerf to either the Witch or the Night Witch for the entirety of the October 2019 season, since they were already under pressure from the player base regarding their poor balancing attempts the previous season, so they wreaked havoc for the entire month. But there is one card that I haven't talked much about that in theory should have risen immensely in popularity but didn't: the Executioner. It doesn't really make sense that the Executioner sat at a 10% usage rate in top ladder in October of 2019, which, while it is high, isn't nearly as high as it should have been. The Executioner should have been a good counter to the Double Witch Elixir Golem combination, not only since its mechanics would benefit from a tank and a support card placed behind it, but also because the Witch and Night Witch could have been killed in 2 hits by the Executioner. So why didn't the Executioner rise in popularity? To put it simply, the Elixir Golem Double Witch combination was so strong and attention grabbing that the Executioner was left in the shadows. A big reason I think it wasn't as heavily used as anticipated was simply because the reworks it received in the previous month meant that its range was much lower than the range of the Witch. So when the Witch had connected to the tower, if an Executioner had been placed to counter an Elixir Golem or a tank in front of her, the axe would never reach the Witch. But this theory is also disproven by the fact that a simple tornado to bring them together would have allowed for a better defense. To be honest, I don't think anyone, not even Supercell themselves, knows why the Executioner was neglected by Clash Royale players in the October 2019. The game had become so chaotic that even an extremely strong card like the Executioner didn't have a chance to thrive at all. The horrifying story of the Halloween 2019 season in Clash Royale would be the result of many factors, both in and out of Supercell's control. A bad set of balance changes, along with the release of a broken card, would initiate a deadly chain reaction that would cause Clash Royale to become overrun by 3 cards, 2 of which were in a terrible position literally a month before these changes, and the final one of the 3 not even being officially released. The fact that the Executioner would receive 4 changes in September meant that Clash Royale had to be careful working on another rework for the Executioner, but this caused them to neglect how strong the Witch and the Night Witch were, which also caused them to refrain from changing the Witch for the entirety of the month. Halloween 2019 will go down as one of the most confusing, annoying, and dark times in the game's entire history.